You're sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone half cold, looking over pension statements, an ISA balance, maybe the latest estimate of what the house is worth, and thinking, all right, we did what we were supposed to do. You worked for years, you put money aside, you tried not to be reckless, you built a retirement that looks, on paper at least, reasonably secure, not extravagant, just sensible, enough, you hope, to live on without constant worry. And then one day the same paperwork is still there, but the question has changed. Now it is sitting next to care home fees. That is the moment many people never really plan for, not because they are careless, but because they assume retirement savings and care costs belong in two different boxes. Pension money is for later life, the house is the family home, ISAs are the cushion for emergencies, and somehow, in the background, there is often a feeling that if care is ever needed, the system will step in unless you are truly wealthy. That is where the surprise begins. In England, needing residential care does not just lead to a simple yes or no answer about help with costs. It brings in a means test, and that means test does not look at your finances in the same casual way most people do when they say, we're comfortable or we're not rich. It looks at categories. It looks at rules, it looks at what counts as capital and what counts as income, and those two things are not treated in the same way. That matters more than many people realize, because the quiet shock is not usually sudden poverty, it is the dawning realization that a person can have what feels like an ordinary, prudent retirement setup and still be expected to pay most or even all of their own care fees for a time. That can feel deeply unfair at first glance. After all, if you spent decades being careful, surely that care should count for something. Surely a pension is there to help you live, not to disappear into fees. Surely a modest ISA is not the sort of money that puts you in the category of self-funding care. But the system does not really ask whether you feel affluent. It asks what assets you have, what income is coming in, and whether certain protections apply. And that is where a lot of confusion comes from. People often hear one fragment of the story and build their whole understanding around it. Someone says, the council takes your house. Someone else says, your pension gets used up. Another person says a spouse can stay in the home and it is protected. Then someone mentions a government cap on care costs, and that sounds reassuring until you look closer and realize the headlines and the actual rules are not always the same thing. So what many families are left with is not clear knowledge, but a patchwork of half-remembered claims. That is not a comfortable place to be, especially when health changes slowly and then all at once. One partner starts needing more help, stairs become harder, nights become unsettled, managing at home becomes more difficult, and suddenly financial planning is no longer just about income in retirement, it is about how later life care is charged. This affects far more people than most imagine, not only the very wealthy, not only people with large investment portfolios. It affects couples with a paid-off house, some savings, a private pension, and a state pension. It affects people who have been sensible rather than rich, people who thought they were prepared because they had done the right things. The good news is that this becomes much less frightening once the rules are made plain, because there are rules, there are thresholds, there are protections. There is a difference between savings and income. There are situations where a home is not counted. There are separate questions when only one partner goes into care. And there are benefits that can help in ways many people overlook completely. Once you understand those pieces, the picture changes, not into panic, into clarity. And that is the key here. The goal is not to assume the worst. It is to stop relying on vague reassurance and start looking at what actually counts, what may be protected, and where a careful retirement plan can still be stronger than it first appears. Because the same pension statement, the same ISA, and the same house value can mean something very different once you know how the assessment really works. The first thing many people want to know is very simple. At what point does the local authority actually help, and at what point are you expected to pay for care yourself? In England, for residential care, the financial assessment starts with capital thresholds. If your capital is above £23,250, you will usually be treated as a self-funder. In plain English, that means you are expected to cover the full cost yourself, at least for the time being. If your capital falls between £14,250 and £23,250, support may begin, but you are still expected to contribute. And if your capital is below £14,250, there may be more help available, although that does not mean your income is ignored. That catches people out, because £23,250 does not sound like a fortune. A cash savings account, a modest ISA, maybe a few investments put aside over the years, and suddenly someone who has never thought of themselves as wealthy is above the line. So the shock is not only for people with very large estates, it can hit people with fairly ordinary retirement savings. And this is where the two big categories matter: capital and income. Capital is the pot of assets you own. That can include savings in the bank, ISAs, investments, and in some situations, the value of property. Income is the money coming in regularly. That includes the state pension, private pensions, and annuities, which are fixed payments from a pension product. Those two categories are not treated as the same thing, but both can affect what you pay. A lot of people assume an ISA has some special shield because it is tax efficient. It does not. For care means testing, an ISA is still part of your capital. The tax wrapper may help with tax, but it does not protect the money from being counted in a financial assessment. Pension income is different, but it is still very relevant. A regular private pension is usually treated as income available toward care fees. The same goes for the state pension. So even when someone's capital has fallen enough for local authority help to start, their income is still part of the picture. The person in care is not usually left with their full income to spend freely. They are generally allowed to keep only a small personal expenses allowance for day-to-day personal items. Then there is the question that carries the most emotion: the home. People often jump straight to, will they make us sell the house? The answer is more specific than that. A home is not always counted. If a spouse, civil partner, or partner is still living there, the property is usually disregarded for the means test. In other words, it is not included in the assessment while that qualifying person remains in the home. Similar protection can also apply in some cases where certain dependent or vulnerable relatives still live there. That matters enormously for couples. If one partner goes into residential care and the other stays at home, the partner at home is not automatically dragged into the same assessment as if both people had moved into care. Their own separate finances are not simply swept together and treated as one big care pot. Even so, shared assets still need careful attention. Joint savings are often treated as belonging half to one person and half to the other, unless there is clear evidence that ownership is different. So, if a couple has always kept everything in joint accounts, the assessment may work from that 50-50 starting point. That can be sobering because it means people need to know not just what they own, but how they own it. And it also explains why two families with similar total wealth can end up in quite different positions. One may have more in joint savings, another may have more in the house. One may have a spouse still living at home, which changes everything about how the property is treated. So the real lesson here is that care funding does not run on assumptions. It runs on categories, thresholds, and specific protections. And once you see that clearly, the next question becomes just as important. If the rules can erode savings more than people expect, how much protection does the government's care cost cap really offer, and where does it fall short? This is where many people feel briefly reassured by a headline and then disappointed when they look closer. You may have heard talk over recent years about a government cap on care costs. The figure most people remember is £86,000, and on the surface, that sounds like a clear promise. Pay up to that point, and then the state takes over. But that is not really how people should picture it. First, the policy itself has been delayed and changed enough that nobody should build a retirement plan around the assumption that a neat, simple cap will definitely solve the problem. Rules can shift, timetables can move, governments can announce one thing and implement another, so it is always worth checking the current position when care planning becomes relevant. And even where a cap is discussed, it does not mean every pound of a care home bill suddenly stops once that figure is reached. That is the part many families miss. A care home bill is not one single block of cost. Part of it relates to personal care. Part may relate to daily living costs, things like accommodation and food. So even if a cap applies to one part, it does not automatically wipe away the full bill. There can still be ongoing costs that the person or family must meet. That matters because a reassuring headline can create false confidence. Someone may think, well, at least there is a ceiling. But in practice, the ceiling may sit over only part of the expense, not the whole thing. So a cap, if and when it applies, is better thought of as one rule within the system, not a shield over all later life care costs. That may sound discouraging, but there is another side to this. Not every form of help depends on your savings, your house, or your pension income in the same way. One of the most overlooked examples is attendance allowance. This is a benefit for people over state pension age who need help with personal care or need supervision because of a disability or health condition. The important point here is that it is not means tested. It does not depend on how much you have in the bank. It is not blocked because you were careful and saved. It is not taken away just because you have a private pension coming in. That surprises a lot of people. Many older adults assume they will not qualify for any support because they own their home, have an ISA, or have what feels like a decent retirement income. But attendance allowance is not about whether you are wealthy or struggling. It is about care needs, and it can make a real difference. For someone still living at home, it may help contribute toward extra support, whether that means help with washing, dressing, staying safe, or simply managing day-to-day life more reliably. It will not solve everything, but it can ease pressure, and because it is not means tested, it belongs in the conversation much earlier than many families realize. There can also be changes to some benefits once a person moves into local authority-funded care, which is another reason to check the current rules rather than rely on old assumptions or something a neighbor once said. And that really brings us back to the kitchen table. The pension statement is still the pension statement, the ISA is still the ISA, the home is still the home. But once you understand the rules, those pieces stop being a vague picture of comfort and become a more accurate map. You can start asking better questions. Which of our assets count as capital and which count as income? If one of us needed care, would the home be disregarded because the other still lives there? Are our joint accounts clearly recorded? Are we assuming a future care cost cap will do more than it really can? Have we checked whether attendance allowance or other support might apply? Would it be sensible to speak to a regulated financial advisor, the local authority, or a benefits specialist before there is a crisis? That is not panic, that is planning, and after 50, that kind of planning matters just as much as building pension income in the first place, because a complete retirement plan is not only about how you will live, it is also about understanding what may happen if care enters the picture. Once you know that, the subject becomes less frightening and more manageable. Not pleasant, perhaps, but manageable. And that is a far better place to be than feeling blindsided by rules you never knew were there.